Thanks. So hopefully everyone can see a hand up. Please wave at me if you can't. And thanks for missing the football to come and listen to me. Very exceptional behaviour. You could just put it on that laptop, everyone can watch. So first of all, thanks to the Beacon Project for funding my research. There were two aspects to it. One was thinking about the exemplary in the political sphere as acting as norm entrepreneurs. That's Sunstein's term. I don't like it very much. I prefer norm revolutionaries. So the idea that maybe what they're doing is showing us different norms we could live by, or breaking our existing norms, and so pushing us forward in terms of justice. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the other aspect. And that was trying to get a small amount of distance on the question, exactly what are the exemplars in the political sphere like? Is there any way in which they're different from the moral sphere or not? So what I'm going to do today is just briefly suggest some reasons I think we might have to move beyond what I'll call the kind of standard or classic exemplars we think about in the political sphere. So why might we do that? And then I'm going to try and suggest to you something that happens when we do. Namely that we move beyond the traditional kinds of motivations and start thinking about things like anger, disgust, and offence. And I'm mostly going to be focusing on offence, because I think it's almost the hardest to get off the ground, right? The idea that someone who engages in political action of a kind that we should admire might be doing it because they're really offended at a slight against themselves. So that's the claim I'm going to try and defend very briefly today. It's actually the subject of a book-length manuscript, so it really is going to be too brief. There's a lot I leave out, but I'm looking forward to your questions. All right, let's get started. So why would we go beyond the standard exemplars? So on the face of it, it looks like the history of political change is just full of exceptional individuals for us to think about. So some protest injustice when the majority of us don't, and they often do so against severe personal costs, and they often endure those costs. So our list of these individuals, as we heard a bit this morning, is likely to be very varied, but they might include people like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, the suffragettes, the White Rose student movement who protested against the Nazis. And so today I'm not going to be very interested in the overall character assessment of these individuals, nor the ones I'm going to talk about. And the reason for that is they often have pretty rubbishy personal lives. That's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people who are moved to act exceptionally in the political sphere, because I think they're exemplary even if they're not great elsewhere. So they're not the fully virtuous Jesus type figure, but they might still be worth considering, given how different they look to the rest of us, right? Most of us do nothing when injustice starts happening, and these people, they act. Okay. But I think if we want to know what people who act in the face of injustice are like, these exceptional people who stand up, that crew isn't the best set of people to always be thinking about. So these are the set I'm going to kind of abandon thinking about are ones who stand up to pretty oppressive regimes, even if they are democracies. Lots of them aren't. And where the costs of standing up look extremely high. So they include in the list I've given force feeding, execution, long-term imprisonment. It's very easy to explain, I think, why most of us aren't like that. We're not good enough to be that self-sacrificing, right? But that, I think, doesn't get us all the way. And here's the reason. I think we should also think about what I'm going to call everyday activists. So not the Mandelas, but the ones who are still willing to protest injustice. So I think there are probably people who, let's say, here's an example of one, would be someone who protests in a liberal democratic society where they know that the costs of protesting will not be terribly high. They may end up with a night or two in jail. They may even go to jail for a couple of months, right? But it's not going to be any higher than that. It's certainly not going to be as extreme and demanding as the normal examples. So why do I think we should make this shift in focus? So first, I think these everyday activists are still exceptional. So most of us do too little. And that's why these people are exceptional too. So I take it that everyone in this room lives in a society that's marred by serious kinds of injustice. Societies that are doing too little about the potentially existential crisis of climate change. So that was me getting caught on the door with the microphone cord. But also marred by serious inequalities in how we relate to each other based on morally arbitrary features, like our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality. These things lead to pervasive, deep inequalities that make our societies unjust. and we do so little about them. So most of us barely remember to recycle, right? That's about all we do for climate change. It's not very impressive, I'm including myself here. We don't call out friends who make inappropriate jokes, even though we know those are playing a role in continuing to perpetuate the kinds of inequalities between people that we should be objecting to. We don't call out friends who have terribly unequal gendered division of labours in their homes. We just don't do it. We don't act. So, even those who act when the costs of doing so are pretty low look morally exceptional. They're willing to act when most of us live with injustice. And when we ask what leads people under conditions like ours to fail to act, looking at the original exemplars misleads us a bit, right? It's not to do with an oppressive state or the particularly high costs. It's not to do with not being altruistic or self-sacrificing enough. It's got to be something else. So here's the other reason to shift in focus. I think if we do that, we might end up with a different and richer picture of the salient traits and motivations that get people to act when most people are unwilling to in the face of injustice. So the usual exemplars, right, those I mentioned at the start, risk so much. They're willing to hugely sacrifice for others. They're willing to engage in heroic self-sacrifice, right? What motivates that might not be the same as what motivates the everyday activists who are still acting exceptionally. Okay, so what do these everyday kinds of activists look like then? So being a philosopher and not a psychologist or a sociologist or an anthropologist, what I'll say here isn't actually intended as a descriptive account of what the morally exceptional who act when the rest of us don't bother in the face of injustice are really like. Instead, what I'm going to do is take some possible emotions that seem to maybe be out there, right? And say, so if they are, could they be part of our picture of the morally exceptional? Could we start making it richer by thinking about those kinds of examples? But I'm not here claiming that people are in fact motivated in all cases or in most cases or in the majority or anything like that in these ways. Okay, there's my please don't hate me psychologist bid. But I am interested still in reflections on whether you think what I've said is at all plausible in terms of a picture of human motivation, of course. Okay, so what kinds of emotions or whatever we want to call them, do I have in mind, right? So one, which has received quite a lot of recent attention in moral and political philosophy, is anger. So it looks like people who are moved to protest injustice are often angry about the injustice. And there have been some fascinating defenses of whether feeling that kind of anger could be part of the makeup of the morally virtuous person or not. But I'm also interested in things that look a little bit less easy to defend, I think. So anger's already controversial, but here's a couple that I think are more controversial. So disgust. I think sometimes the right reaction to injustice and the reaction that might be motivating people who act exceptionally in acting could be that they are disgusted at the injustice they see. So here's an example of the kind of injustice that could disgust. Seeing extreme poverty in a capitalist society where others are engaging in the needless and excessive consumption of expensive luxuries. That might lead to a disgust reaction. And that disgust might motivate some to act, right? That looks like it might be part of the makeup of someone who is driven to act when most don't. Or towards a repeat sexual harasser, right? These individuals we often regard as disgusting. And that disgust might motivate us to do something about it. Right, engage in social shaming, protect our students, and so on. So too, I think, there's taking offence, okay? So that's going to be the subject of the majority of this paper before I come back around to the morally exceptional at the end. So why might taking offence be part of the makeup of someone who acts, and why might that be a defensible part of a makeup of someone who acts against injustice? So the kind of offence I have in mind here is where people take offence at small slights to their standing, the kind of pervasive, small-scale, disrespectful treatment that members of disadvantaged groups of various kinds often face. There'll be some examples as I go. So that's the kind of offence I've got. So it's disrespectful treatment by virtue of some feature of your identity or perceived identity that is not seen as equal to others in the kinds of societies that you live in. Okay, so this taking offence is my issue that I'm going to think about more closely for much of the rest of the paper. So I think this is a pretty pressing issue to consider in this context. given the kinds of reactions that people who protest are current rather than historic injustice, so historical stories of these great individuals who stand up, we don't tend to say these kinds of things, but people who are currently protesting often face attacks on their moral character. And when they do, it's largely around the idea, or at least this is one strong strand, right, that they take offence too easily. That we should just let these little barbs fly past us, there's no need to take it so seriously, isn't the kind of thing we should be reacting to at all. So I'm thinking here of recent protests against millennials as a kind of generation snowflake, right? They're too fragile and unable to endure even minor slights. And they're accused in newspaper articles and so on of taking offence too easily at things that others regard as pretty innocuous or just not worth that level of attention. So things that have prompted that kind of newspaper reaction would include campaigns against microaggressions, which are those minor everyday slights that members of disadvantaged groups often face, like being asked, well, where are you really from? And also it's certainly a kind of recurring criticism of feminists, that they fall into this category of people who take offence too easily. So you see it historically in kind of earlier waves of feminism, where the thought is, look, a man patting you on the bottom in the workplace, it's just not a big deal, why would you be offended about that? And it's come back again around the Me Too protests, right? So where that started to go beyond the most obvious forms of abuse or harassment into things that others regarded as normal kind of dating behaviours or accidents that might happen in the dating sphere when you didn't understand the other person's intentions or something, also gets charged as being just taking offence too easily. Okay, an aside before I start to defend this about what exactly I'm claiming here. So I'm not claiming that offence is what does motivate these people, right? They may equally be motivated by an impartial sense that this is what justice demands. That's also a legitimate motivation. In a sense, all I'm trying to say is, so what if it is offence that motivates these people? Should that mean that we think that their actions aren't morally good ones, that they couldn't be exemplary actors in protesting against injustice, because part of the motivational story is that they are offended by these slights? And I'm going to say, no, taking offence looks like a really sensible, appropriate thing to do. Okay, so we'll see if I manage to convince you in a very short period of time. So as I said, this forms the kind of heart of a book manuscript that covers a lot of issues. So I'm just going to try and offer one or two of the central arguments and see if I can get you on my side with that alone rather than with the whole book. So I'm going to defend taking offence even over the apparently small stuff. And the reason I think this is interesting to those of us who are thinking about the morally exceptional is two reasons I think why it might be interesting. So first, I'm hoping that I'm going to encourage some people to think that maybe the motivations of the morally exceptional, those who act exceptionally in the political sphere is who I'm talking about, are a little bit more varied than just moral courage or loving self-sacrifice. There might be other stuff going on, and we might not want to think it's all tainting or something, right? We might not want to rule these people out just because they're taking offence or because they're doing something of that kind. And once I've got the defence of offence in view, even quicker, I'm going to try and offer the very beginnings of carving out a conception of the morally exceptional that would be something beyond loving self-sacrifice and sort of courageous action and these sorts of things. I'm probably not going to have enough time to get into detail on that one, but I will gesture towards it as I conclude and welcome questions. Okay, so the defence. So we're on point 2 on the handout. So I'm going to begin with the kind of offence I have in mind. So my interest is offence that slights to standing, and I'm particularly interested, although not exclusively interested, in the offence taken by those who face systematic inequalities or discrimination on the basis of some facet of their identity or presumed identity. So take someone reacting to constant misgendering, or the woman whose expertise is perpetually discounted or disregarded because she's a woman, and so on. And as I've already said, with especially but not exclusively members of these groups, this is a kind of offence that lots of people take. In fact, I think everyone, or nearly everyone, could be taking this kind of offence. I think it's quite common, actually, in members of people who aren't members of any disadvantaged group. So if we think about the sexist husband offended when his wife makes a joke about him in public because he thinks the appropriate role of a wife is to be perpetually deferential. Okay, he might take offence when she makes this joke. Or the man in the club that you bump into and spill his drink, right, takes offence. So I think it spreads out beyond. Or for maybe a more familiar example for many of us would be the student who emails you, hey there, or hey guys, or whatever, rather than using any kind of title or proper form of address, right? You might take offence, right? Okay. So, some people might already be thinking that this form of taking offense looks like a kind of anger, right? But I'm not going to treat it as a form of anger or just borrow from the existing literature on anger. And there's two reasons for that. So one is I actually think it isn't quite a form of anger, or if it is, it's a weird kind. So it's true that it's a reaction to slights. It's true that it can lead to a kind of angry reaction to slights or resentment or something. But I think if I'm offended, there's a bunch of other ways I could feel. So I could feel frustrated or irritated. I actually think you could possibly be offended and feel amused. So I think this might be a correct picture of how I feel after 5 or 6 years of being an academic. That still, even in situations where it's very clear I'm not a student, like I've walked in with all the handouts and I'm standing at the podium, students will often think that I am also a student, right? That is amusing and offensive. And I don't think I'm being strange when I find it more amusing than anything else. It's only going to have an anger reaction. There's no payback desire. There's no resentment there. I think it's funny. I also think it's offensive. So I think that maybe it doesn't look quite like anger, although I'm really interested if you disagree. The other reason I'm not going to treat it just as a form of anger is I think if it is, it's a really funny kind in what it communicates, what it's prompted by, how it works. And so it wouldn't fit the existing strategies quite as well anyway. So hopefully I'm going to show you that in what I'm next going to say. But if you're not convinced, I'd love to come back to that. OK, so if we were going to defend taking offense, there'd be two things we'd have to look at. One would be the inner states of the person. What's it like to be someone who's offended or offends easily? What kinds of features of the world are they paying attention to? Should they have that kind of orientation to the world? And the other would be, I assume, because it's the kind of reaction that nearly always comes with some kind of manifestation, would be how does it actually lead us to intervene in the world? What do we do when we're offended? And does that look okay? Does that look like an okay intervention into our social worlds or not? Okay, the moral character of those who take offense. So, if you like grief, shame, taking offense involves having a certain belief. So in the case of grief, it's that you've lost some valuable other. In the case of shame, that you've done something shameworthy that others could or might know about or do know about. In the case of offense, it looks to me like you must have the belief that your standing has been slighted. My kind of offense, right? There are other kinds of offense out there. My kind is a reaction to a slight to standing. So you must think your standing has been slighted. And that means you've got to have a particular orientation to your standing. You've got to notice it, right? It's got to be the kind of thing you attend to. What is my standing and how do others react to me, and is it fitting with what I take my standing to be? And I take it that one challenge to Generation Snowflake, those millennials, right, is that they're over-attentive to these slights. That's what goes wrong. The pattern of attention or the orientation to their standing, that's why we should criticize them. It's too much. So how do we get it right then? Over the page on your handouts. OK, just a caveat, I'm not going to have time to say enough about this here. You've got to be claiming the right amount of standing to get it right. So what I mean by that is you can't be claiming more standing than you are owed. So that's where the sexist husband goes wrong. He's not owed constant deference from his wife, right? It's not an appropriate level of standing to be requiring. And what's the right amount of standing to claim? I'm just going to have to be really vague for the purposes of this paper. It takes at least a chapter to outline that, but roughly it's the kind of standing where you are not being marginalized or dominated or oppressed and so on by others. In short, where you kind of stand as an equal. What that means is super complex, and I actually think one part of the answer is that you're able to make the kinds of claims to be treated in the way that you want to be treated, that when you're not often cause offense. So I think answering the question about offense is going to tell us something about standing, but I'm not going to have time to do that today. So I'm just going to leave that there as a claim that I'm not going to defend. OK, so how else do you get it right when you take offense? Two things. You can't have too much attention to your standing, right? So the person who perpetually takes offense at little slights looks a bit uncharitable, right? They might read into relations to others that they're constantly offending them. It doesn't leave much room for normal kinds of human relations if someone is constantly attentive to the precise degree of standing that she is owed and whether it's being respected in all instances constantly. Okay, so that person's not our ideal. But I also think, and this is more controversial, I think, that it's not our ideal to pay too little attention to your standing. So that I think is a little bit more controversial. So some of you might be thinking, well, what about the really humble person, right? They look like a really good person. Someone who's just oblivious to the slights and slurs of everyday life, who doesn't care if others treat them disrespectfully, who as happily live in a bin on the street as in a house that's really fancy. What about that person? Aren't they a morally good person? They don't take offense at slights to their standing. They don't care about their standing. Okay. So it seems obvious to me that that person is not an attractive exemplar if what's going on in their head is a belief that they are worthless, right? That's not appealing, is it? That's just inaccurate about the person, not a great way to encourage people to feel. But there might be a better model. So this is a kind of, I've borrowed it from the modesty literature. So you might think, look, the person who pays less attention to their standing may just be directing their attention away from the fact that they're equals to others. So just like we might direct our attention away from our good qualities. So we're aware we have them, we're not ignorant, right? We just don't attend to them, and that's the extent to which we're modest. You might think, well, the humble person, when it comes to standing, they know they're others' equals, but they just direct their attention away from that, right? They're not interested when that isn't respected by others. They don't react to that kind of action. So why aren't they our moral ideal? So I think the really important difference between modesty, which I don't have much more to say than that about, and this kind of standing attention, which I think is different, right? Because modesty is about your good qualities that mark you out from others, and standing is about what you have in common with everyone, which is an equality of standing. To some extent, it's really complicated, I'll get to that a bit. I mean, so to have equality of standing in my sense would include being addressed as dear Professor X if you are in fact a professor, because that's what it is to treat you equally. It's to respect the professional qualifications that you have received. So it's not, I realise it's slightly complicated, but I think you can see where I'm going with that. Anyway, so the difference then between modesty and standing in my sense is that when your standing is slighted and you just turn away, that may have an impact on others in a way that's less clear in the modesty case. So very often, although not always, these slights to standing pertain to some feature you share with others that tends to be the kind of feature that leads to disadvantage and discrimination. So if you turn the other cheek, you are not standing up not only for yourself, but also other members of your group, right? You are refraining from attending to the standing that also impacts others. And this is the next stage of my argument. I think taking offence is a way to stand up for the standing, both of yourself and of those who share the relevant feature by virtue of which you've been disrespected. Okay. So here's a simple story. So now I'm moving on to what offence does. Here's a simple story about why offence could be standing up for standing, because maybe that doesn't sound convincing to all of you. So the simple story would just say, look, when someone's offended, they tend to act. If I don't show any manifestation that I'm offended, we tend to ask for some kind of explanation of my behaviour. Maybe I'm too scared of the amount of power you have over me to stand up and say anything. Maybe it's just not the right moment, I'm saving it for later. But normally when we're offended, I might raise an eyebrow, I might make a cross face, I might cut you out of future relations, I might refuse to be invited to places where you'll be. It's a massive range of what offence reactions can look like, okay? But I tend to have some kind of manifestation. I tend to be trying to convey to you that I am offended in some way. And so goes a simple story. Being offended imposes costs on others. Since it imposes costs on others, it's a way of encouraging them to refrain from the behaviour in future. It's not the kind of behaviour you should engage in again. And when it comes to the really small stuff I'm talking about, the apparently small stuff, right? Like using the correct titles and respecting someone's pronouns and not asking offensive questions. Looks like just having a bit of a cost imposed is going to be enough to deter people from bothering to do it again, right? So there we are. Take offence, stand up to your group, you just impose costs. Incredibly briefly, I don't think that's quite the full story. So I prefer a kind of more group, less individual story about what's going on here. And the way I go about it in the book is by going via social norms. So in very short, here's the thought I'm having there. So respect and our relative degrees of standing are often conveyed through the kinds of politeness norms we have in our society and the ways those do or don't get respected. So you're meant to bow to the Queen. You're meant to address a professor, dear Professor X, and not hey there you or something. You are meant to shake hands when you meet someone and not bow. Okay? And those are all ways in which we express a certain kind of respect for others. These politeness norms look like they're about respect. And, next claim, when you're in a deeply unequal society like ours, you often see in those social norms a pattern whereby some groups get more respect than others by virtue of the kinds of norms we use to treat them with. Okay? So two simplistic example would be holding doors open for women but not men, if that's the norm you've got in your society. That may be subtly conveying something about standing. Okay, so hopefully that was moderately convincing. I think that the culture of taking offence, so Generation Snowflake stuff's coming back here. Obviously I don't endorse those titles, I'm just defending them. I think it's often directed, although not always, at that kind of social norm about what's polite, appropriate, or beyond the pale. Because that's the extreme end of the politeness norms, right? There's some stuff that just cannot be done, cannot be happening. So the offence in question is often taken at behaviours deemed widely acceptable in a society, like dressing in culturally inspired fancy dress, hitting on a woman in the workplace, or asking the only woman in the room to take notes, and so on. And the goal of taking offence in these cases is not to change the law, right? We're not going to have laws about fancy dress costumes and title use and pronoun use. It's to change the norms around that stuff, right? So when you have your seminar on the first day of term, you might ask, so what pronouns does everyone prefer? That's the request being made, not that there's a law that you never use the wrong pronoun, okay? So I think it's in this realm of norms. So then very briefly, and I'm just going to have to sketch this, and it's on your handout, the three things I think. So I think taking offence might go for those norms that we want to change, those norms about respect and standing. So how would it do that? So I think it can challenge or propose norms. So if I take offence when you think you're following the normal norm of us, this is what members of our group do, that can be a way of saying, no, this isn't what members of our group do. I'm not going to get into proposes because it's more complicated. I think taking offence can also change the meaning of the norm. And that can be the route by which we're trying to act. So the thought I'm having here is that, look, once upon a time, having sex segregation or gender segregation in toilets was just normal. And now it might be seen as a deliberate act of refusing a certain demand of trans rights activists. Okay? So it sort of changes the meaning from just being the usual thing we do around here because it's nice or something, to this is a thing you do if you want to make clear that you don't sign up to that progressive agenda that you object to. And the other thing it does, I think, is it imposes costs, right? So that was my simple story about why taking offence stood up for your standing. It just imposes costs. Now it gets slightly more complicated. It might be imposing costs of a particular kind. So social norm following is part of what gives us identity in a certain kind of group, right? So if I think I'm a progressive, I better do what other progressives think people like us should do, right? The norms of behaviour that we follow together. So if I take offence, I can suggest then that the previous norm is not the progressive one anymore. So if you want to be a progressive, you better abide by these new norms, right? The old ones are now offensive, stop using them. Okay, so that's a very brief story. So obviously I haven't managed to fully defend it. There's lots of stuff I've left out. So degree of costs of someone taking offence at you. What should you do when someone takes offence at you? What exactly is equal standing? And that's why what I thought was going to be a short paper turned into this burgeoning mass that is now having to become a manuscript. So, yep. But I'm very happy to chat about anything that has occurred to you from the brief picture that I gave. The last thing I want to do in the final couple of minutes is just return to the morally exceptional once more. So I said I started because I wanted to get away from the traditional exemplars. I thought maybe we'd get more varied motivations and character traits and all sorts if we went away from them and just looked at people who are exceptional because they do stuff when most of us do nothing. So what do I think we might be able to learn from thinking about this one particular case, for the case of the morally exceptional? So, traditionally, recently, in political philosophy, there's been a divide between the partial perspective and the impartial perspective. The partial is the self-interested perspective where I act for my own interests. The impartial is the standpoint of justice. I leave aside my own interests, connections, community, and I think about what all are owed from the point of view of this kind of distant observer. So I think if it's true that there are people who are being moved to protest injustice by motives like disgust, anger, in a kind of anger at something that also affects oneself, that's a caveat, and taking offence, then it might be that we're in the realm of something in between the partial and the impartial. So it's not impartial, right? I'm talking about people who are acting for something that has affected them and those like them, not an abstract, detached perspective. But it's not strictly partial either. So it involves myself, but it's not restricted to myself, right? I'm not trying to maximize my self-interest when I take offense. I'm trying to change how people like me are treated. And I think there's something deeply strange, although you might disagree, about saying that our exemplar should be someone who only acts for the other in this sphere, right? So we're saying that people who protest injustice, serious injustice, those who are members of advantaged groups are morally better people than those who are members of disadvantaged groups who protest injustice. That just doesn't ring quite right to me. So the thought I'm having then is that maybe we do want to say these everyday activists are moral exemplars, because we don't want to say you have to be really detached, the loving saint, purely altruistic self-sacrifice, because then we have to say anyone who protests injustice that faces them is not morally exemplary, and that sounds unusual to me. And if we do that, then maybe we can keep all these richer emotions in the picture, right? Because it's affecting them. Of course they're going to feel things like anger at stuff that affects them, and take offence when they're slighted, and feel disgust. So there's my plea for a broader range of emotions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my question was, I wonder if you might speak a little bit to the relationship between offense reactions and moral disagreement. So I'm thinking particularly, so you talked about our group, but I guess it often seems like part of the difficult cases are where we have different groups. And if I think about kind of broad range of moral and political communities in pluralistic societies, I think like, okay, could there be broad agreement across these communities about the moral evil found in what the Me Too movement and protesters are protesting? Well, yeah, okay, good. So that's good. But there are other cases that seem to be more difficult. So I wonder if you might say where you think, how you think offense reactions fit in with cases of disagreement.
Great, so it's really interesting. So you're right, there are deep disagreements, and that's one of the reasons I use the toilet segregation example, is I think that's a case of deep disagreement about how we should act there. So the thought I have, and this is why I didn't get enough into the equal standing. So here's the thought I have very roughly. So suppose you meet an academic from a particular country. A norm of politeness would say that you go along with what the greeting is for that person. So you guys have to negotiate that, right? Because you've got these different greeting norms. So in the UK, it's shaking hands. But when I meet an Italian colleague, it's often kissing on the cheek. It might be different numbers of kissing for different European countries. Sometimes it's hugging. There's all sorts of different norms about what the polite and respectful way to greet each other are. So normally, what do we do in that scenario? Well, there's a bit of negotiation because we're coming from these two different norms, but we tend to go along with what's good for the other person, right? We have an instinct to defer to what the other person's going to feel comfortable with, because what we're trying to do is greet them in a way they're comfortable with, right? And the thought I have is, it looks to me like a lot of these things that are causing pervasive disagreement and discomfort in our societies are cases where people are just making requests to be treated in the way they want to be treated, that fall well within the remit of the normal demands that we get to make of one another. Like how we get greeted, and what kind of clothing is appropriate for different kinds of settings. And those norms we've had all along. So this is just a question of renegotiating them now. Some groups have a bit more power than they used to have. And we shouldn't be so surprised or amazed at this kind of negotiation. We're pretty used to it, right? So, when you go to a funeral, people will give different instructions as to what the dress code would be, given what they think the norm of appropriate, respectful wear at funerals is. So some people say, I want everyone in pink, and some people say, I want everyone in black, and some people say, well, only close family should be in black, and everyone else should be, and you just go with what the person requests. So I think that a lot of the cases that are causing particular amounts of outrage and disagreement at the moment fall into precisely that category. You should just go with what the group requests, unless there's a good reason not to. Yeah, like the funeral clothing. Okay, right. Does that, yeah, it might not be fully satisfactory, but that's the brief. Other questions? I didn't see, yeah.
Yeah, I was curious what you thought about the possibility of taking offence at behaviour that doesn't challenge your standing, that challenges to you witness behaviour that's kind of dismissive of someone else or some other group. So I'm not sure whether that be taking offence on someone else's behalf or just finding offensive behaviour that's challenging someone else. So do you think that counts as taking offence in your terms? And if it does, is it good, or maybe sometimes be distasteful to take offence at treatment towards some other groups?
Great question. I'm still thinking it through. So my initial thought was the following, that it was a bit like pride. So when Hume says, look, you can't take pride at the beautiful fish in the sea that's got nothing to do with you. In the same sense, you can't take offence at a slight that has to standing that has nothing to do with you, right? You just kind of misfire. It's not the right kind of emotion to have. There are others you should have, just not that one. But now I'm thinking that maybe that was too quick. So I'm still trying to think about it. A first stab, though, at whether we should do it. So I think it might be conceptually okay to do so now. I've changed my mind about the Hume fish example. But I think it might not be morally advisable to do it. But I'm still working out the reasons why. So it's something like, it might just be a caution thing, that it's too easy to get it wrong if it's on someone else's behalf. It might be to do with whether that's the most useful reaction you can have. So I'm still trying to think through the grounds on which I think it's not the way to go. As it happens, I think it's not the way to go, but I haven't got the argument in line. Thank you. I'll think about it more.
So thank you for your talk. And as a psychologist, I really like your account. You're talking about norms. You're allowing people to have emotion. It's really good.
Yes.
I'm gonna write that one. I just want to point at or think about a connection. And so in the psychology literature, one of the reasons, or one of the hypothesized reasons that bad things continue, bad norms persist, right, is that people privately feel bad about these things, but they're afraid to speak up, and they look around them and they don't see anyone else speaking up, so they infer that they must be alone in feeling that. And then you do the research, you find that no, actually, other people are just as offended as you are, just nobody's doing anything. So it occurs to me that one of the things that taking offense could do is it allows others to speak up by adjusting people's misperceptions of norms. This feeling that I'm bothered by this, but I don't see anybody else doing anything, so maybe I'm alone. What taking offense allows people to do is to say, oh, I'm not alone. This person is upset too, and it unlocks that sort of, or allows that person to speak up. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Mostly that I really like it, and I'm going to add it in if that's okay. That sounds exactly the kind of role that I think it might be playing. I was thinking about a similar role that isn't quite the same, of letting people propose norms. So there's a lot of literature on norm enforcement norms, which are really strong, right? So people don't like it when you try and enforce a norm that isn't a norm, and we're liable to try and impose the right kind of costs on you and so on. And the thought I had actually is when you take offense, in a way what you're doing is proposing a new norm. And if no one's then like, no, you're being offended here is just crazy, that's not the right way, then in a way you've successfully proposed a new norm, right? You've started to shape people's views into thinking this is indeed the way we should be behaving. So I think this might be one more of the...
actual beliefs to
yeah. It's an even nicer way of putting it. Yeah, so hopefully everyone is actually much more just than they act like in public, and so once people start taking it, but I mean, yeah, so maybe it can go this way, maybe it can go my way. Yeah, but I like the idea, and I'll have a look into that. Thank you.
So I've got a question about renegotiating norms. That was a very interesting sort of part of your talk, as was your talk in general. So who plays a part in renegotiating norms? Who gets to, and how does that fit in with the obligations of people with respect to those norms? So let's say somebody opens a door for a woman, and the woman is offended, to take an example, thinking that that's not appropriate. And then someone else does not open a door for a woman, and she takes offense with the idea that her standing is not being recognized because the door was not open for her. you could use other examples with the way that members of certain, let's say, racial groups are identified, and you could have two different people within that group in the workplace with two different ideas about how they should be. So how, who gets to do the renegotiating, and what sort of then responsibility is there for people to follow those norms?
Great questions. So as to who gets to, all of us, I think. It's just that some groups have greater sort of likelihood of being deserving of the reformation than others, right? So that's a kind of thought. And what about obligations? So the one way I try and get around your worry about individuals within the same group having very different ideas about what the politeness norms are is to say that it has to be recognizably a group's norms. So if you're a real outlier, right, you're the only woman left in the world who thinks that all women should have doors open to them by all men, then your norm is not to be taken terribly seriously. It's not really a norm, right? It's not what people like you do. It's not a norm for this community. But if there is a genuine division, then it gets much more tricky. But then it was going to be tricky, right? This social stuff is never very simple. So I take it that we're all in the business of renegotiating these. There can be divides in communities. And as an individual then responding to what might be offensive, I think you have a certain set of obligations to try and track what everyone is thinking and feeling and finds respectful. But I take it that we already think we have those obligations. That's my example of how to greet the other academic, right? If you know they're from a country where kissing is quite an unusual way to greet someone, probably don't go in for the kiss, right? Probably that's not, I think Americans, is it safe to say, I feel like the European kissing maybe doesn't translate that well. I think if I dive for someone to go for a couple of kisses, it's not going to translate very nicely. So I take it that just in the same way in the workplace, if you know that it's a member from a group where there's a bit of a disagreement about the appropriate treatment, probably best to kind of find out what they think. In the same way that I might seek not to do 3 kisses on the cheek every time I meet an American, because I know it's probably not going to be received in quite the right way. So I guess that's it. But then that also brings with it certain kinds of limitations. So if you have a quirky, super unusual view of how you should be greeted, I'm not really at fault if I don't go with it. Okay? If you find shaking hands really offensive, you have kind of got an obligation to tell me, right? Because that really does seem like a normal, pretty unoffensive way of greeting people. You better tell me. So I think there's going to be a division of labor in terms of epistemic labor of finding out the correct behaviors. That is way too brief, but that's the thought. Yes, I guess I'm conceding it's messy. We're all in the business of negotiating, and the responsibilities look complex and are divided between the offender and the person who's offended, depending on the circumstances. Not very satisfying.
Okay, so I've favored a cluster near me first, so can we go back here?
Thanks for that, really interesting. So first, a couple of historical notes. You're absolutely right that what you want to say about offense doesn't sit neatly with the contemporary anger literature, but it is more or less reproducing Aristotle's account of anger.
Great.
As centrally concerned with standing. That's really the central issue. And I wondered, in relation to the earlier question about being offended on someone's behalf, that's really dodgy territory in a way, whether one might be able, at least sort of being informed by an Aristotelian take on this, which you wouldn't want to go all the way with, one might be offended. So suppose we're both in the in-group and you make some joke or some inappropriate whatever, somebody I might be offended that you think I'm going to go along with that. Right? So it is still sort of on my own behalf that I'm offended. What I'm offended by is that you think I'm just going to let that pass. That you think I'm going to laugh when you make that joke, whatever it is. So that might be a way to preserve this sense that there can be something right about it, but that still offense is different from anger and righteous indignation, it can be impersonal. And the final postscript is, it's Mill's fault, and did you want to take him on, and do you want the implications? But you don't have to answer.
Yes, to some extent. So in the long run, I want to come back around to the legal and political philosophers who take offence, being offended as a kind of brute fact of the matter. And then there's just an endless debate about whether it's harmful to be offended. And that's the only language we have to talk about offence. So we never ask, is it okay that you got offended? That's not on the table, really. The only way we let that happen is, did you deliberately seek out the circumstance where you'd likely be offended? So we don't have very much sympathy for the Mormon who goes to the Book of Mormon musical, right? Like, it's obviously going to be offensive to them, so they're not really owed legal protections for that, right? So yeah, I want to move away from that whole discourse. I think it both doesn't give agency to the people feeling offence, it doesn't respect the way in which offence is an interesting way to act. So yes, I do want to take on Mill in the long run. To the first point, yes. So, okay, so I need to go back to look at the original stuff. So I looked at Nussbaum and I was like, oh, it looks a lot like my anger and offence. That's Aristotelian, so I'm not going to claim that I've read enough of the Aristotle to know if that's true. But I was worried about her extra thought that it had to involve payback or retribution. So I don't know the extent to which that's true to the original text, but I don't think taking offence necessarily does. So I think when we take offence, particularly in interpersonal relations, there's often no payback or retribution element going on at all. Right? It's not that I'm blocking it or I override it. Offence can be very minor. It can just be a raised eyebrow. It can just be a small word. I don't necessarily intend any other effects on the person. Yes, it is, but I don't think that counts as payback or retribution. But maybe I have a wrong perception of what. That just sounds too minor to count as payback or retribution. It's trying to keep someone on the straight and narrow, and payback and retribution seems like we're trying to lessen the other. And I take it that the goal is to bring someone into the right kind of set of norms, not to lessen the other. Maybe this sounds more like the Aristotle. I'm going to have a think about that. Thank you. That's really helpful. I will go back round to have another look at that. Thank you. What's that? Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, sorry. So this was really interesting, and I have a practical question. Practical worry that is maybe in the direction of your, like, well, you know, the snowflake labeling type of people who get offended. Maybe the worry is how to deal with the different kind of practical effect of people who get offended is not so much that they get dismissed per se as like easily offended, but almost like a shaming fatigue that sets in those who get shamed. So you, like, family relationship, etc. I'm around people who get like shamed all the time, and maybe like first they were receptive to correction, but at this point they're just so like, you know what, no matter what I do, somebody gets offended, so screw, you know, whatever, I'm just gonna do what I'm doing, and since I'm offending everybody anyway, might as well keep going my merry way. So do you have anything?
I think that's super interesting, and I actually hadn't thought directly about it. I had a set of things I was thinking about, but that wasn't one of them. Interesting. I guess I'd want to know how prevalent that reaction is. You had a whole movement. Yeah, so okay, so this is what's not convincing, right? The whole movement claim or the kind of backlash stuff. So previously, there's always been backlashes when we have pushes for social justice, always. And then people say, oh, you know, it was the wrong tactics. You shouldn't have done it that way. You should have been nicer. You should have explained things to people. It makes them angry. They get fed up. Poor little people, like it's not fair for them. And the reason I'm not terribly sort of interested in that sort of backlash, inevitable movement, because of course no one wants to give up their power and their standing, right? But if we're going to renegotiate the relations between groups, someone's got to do that. So yeah, there's going to be backlash. But it has previously been the case that we still moved forward, even with the backlash, right? The backlash is like the dying gasps, or I would like to think it's the dying gasps. They're still not quite down on the floor yet, but the slowly diminishing gasps or something of a group that is having to change its ways. So yeah. That's not very satisfactory. So the more serious answer, though, would be, rather than looking at the backlash groups, but to think about this shaming fatigue and how serious a threat it is to when we're negotiating these social norms in our interpersonal relationships. The example you gave directly, right, the family case. And I'm going to have to see if there's any psychology out there, any psychologists who can help me. I'd love to know, and try and understand the mechanism of that a bit better to have a better response to that. But thank you very much for that question. I'm really going to take that seriously. I'd only thought about it in terms of the backlash groups and hadn't taken it seriously enough, so thank you.
All right, so let's thank her again. And,